Writers, agents, and publishers, for the first time since the Gutenberg Press, find themselves lost in a maze of mystery as technology alters the shape of the publishing industry. Searching for Answers is a group of writers throwing pop culture, writing, and publishing into a crucible of clarity, passion, and humor. This group is the Right Pack. Welcome back to Right Pack Radio. This is your host, producer, and crazy author, David Allen Lucas, president of St. Louis Writers Guild, president of Winding Trails Media, and executive producer. It's amazing what happens when one person runs a whole show. And as well as working currently back on writing psychologically dark stories, studying the darker side of humanity by telling superhero stories. And as well as working on my dark poetry, which it was recently amazed by some people.
Of the Burbs.
Yeah, the it of the recent Festival of the Burbs in Chesterfield on the literary arts side. I'm sorry, Brad. I know you read. I thought you read was fantastic, but
I'm sure it was.
Nobody wanted to hear about Diogenes.
Nobody wanted to hear about that. They wanted to hear about children going missing and people dying for drugs.
Well, it was a music festival.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, granted.
Certain crowd.
And we are going to have a very interesting topic today, so sit tight. I can guarantee you're going to be wanting to hear it. But I just got a couple of quick announcements for myself, and then I'm going to kick this over to my beautiful co-host over there. First off, by now my website should be up, www.davidallenlucas.com. It's a little bare bones, but second announcement, by commercial voice demo will be on the website, and possibly by the time this airs, my narrator demo might be on the website as well. You'll be able to find that there. Third, so far I am still on target for releasing the first book in the series I'm working on in early 2018. That will be more updated as we get there. And with that, I kick this now over to my fellow co-host.
Hello, my name is Kathleen Kayembe. I am a speculative fiction writer. I have a short story called You Will Always Have Family, a triptych, in the March 2017 edition of Nightmare Magazine, which you can find online. You can also find my essay on Octavia Butler and her effect on my life on okafrica.com. And it'll be appearing in Luminescent Threads, an anthology about connections to Octavia Butler that's out August 15th. I also do freelance editing and am putting together an Amherst Writers and Artists writing workshop group. And what else? I write paranormal romance under the pen name Kaseka and Vita.
Hi, my name is Chanel Achan.
Hi, Chanel.
Yeah. I just write things, you know, I just write. I don't have anything coming out or currently published anywhere that you'll be able to find it, and if you do, let me know so that I can hunt people down. But yeah, I just write things like literary fiction and speculative fiction. Good times.
Jen?
My name is Jennifer Sulzer. I'm a children's book author and illustrator. You can check out my fantasy novel Threadcaster on Amazon and at Main Street Books again in St. Charles, since I've refilled my stock over there.
Yay!
You can call them up and get a signed copy mailed to you. It's about the only way you can get a signed copy, unless you email me, I guess.
Or go to Main Street Books.
You go to Main Street, yeah, or you could physically arrive at Main Street Books and pick one up. Speaking of Main Street Books, I assume that we're still in August?
I think we are still in August at the very end.
Well, if we are at the very end of August, and this didn't come out in the first weekend of September, then you can still go to Main Street Books and arrive at the Pirate Princess Pirate Party on September the 9th from 10 to noon. I'm hoping 10 to 1. We'll
Speaking of which, that would be the second week of September.
That would be the second week. Well, you definitely can come now.
Yeah.
Time is weird. Space is warped and time is bendable.
It's the weebly wobbly things.
Yes.
Brad R. Cook, author of The Iron Chronicles, which is Iron Horseman, Iron Zulu, and Iron Lotus. I have just recently released The Doomed Flight of the Majestic, which is a cool short story set in the golden age of Hollywood. It's kind of decently punk, too. And then be on the lookout, because this November you're going to get to read my brand new series, Steam Tree. It's steampunk. It's fun. It's got, you know, airships and dragons. It's a good day.
So
Come check that out this November.
the start of a brand new series.
Yes.
Ooh.
Hooray.
Nice.
And with that, I kick this over now to my lovely wife.
I'm Melanie Lucas, and I will say preparing for this talk today has already inspired some editing help for my current fantasy work.
Wonderful.
Yes, it's led me to think, okay, what's the problem with this story structure? Because I already knew there was a problem, so now I have a method for trying to fix it. So, hooray.
Awesome.
And with us is also the lovely Madame of Murder, who is I'm very jealous about because where she's going.
Where she's been.
Scotland.
Where she's been.
No, I think
Where
she's
she
still
is
going.
currently?
When
Yeah.
do you leave?
In a week.
When do you come back?
Oh, the end of the month.
End of September?
No, the
No.
end of
August.
Oh,
So
yeah,
she's
so
come back.
you have come and gone.
Yeah.
So okay.
Come back from Scotland.
Obviously.
Still,
Makes
I'm
more
jealous. Just
time
want to say that.
spendable.
I'm Fedora Amos. I write Victorian whodunits like Jack the Ripper in St. Louis and Mayhem at Buffalo Bill's Wild West. And I have good prospects for my current one that's at my publishers because my developmental editor, Alice Duncan, gave it a go-ahead. So I'm doing the tip sheets now, and I hope to have good news for that by the time I get back from Scotland.
Excellent.
I also am president of Greater St. Louis Sisters in Crime, and I want to give a shout out to the Booked On Book Club in St. Charles. I'm going to see them on September the 7th, and ladies, thank you for the picture. They sent me a picture which has them holding my books. I love it.
Oh, nice.
Cool.
And finally with us is...
My name is George Soroy. I am an author of science fiction for the young adult reader. My book Excelsior and the 5-part serial From Parts Unknown can both be found on Amazon. From Parts Unknown can also be seen on Smashwords, Kobo, iBooks, and Barnes & Noble. You can also hear me on Amazon as the voice of several books right now, one of them being Argentum Pause Volume 2 by Debbie Mamber-Kupfer, as well as the children's book Rumpel-Pimple by Suzanne DeWitt-Hall, and The Golden Rule by Jessica Baumgardner. I am also the proud president of the Missouri Writers Guild, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys at PennCon, September 29th and 30th, and at Archon on October 1st.
And at PennCon, you'll also be able to see Brad Cook at a table, and myself, and T.W. Finley,
Well,
who's
speaking at PennCon.
here also speaking at
Yeah, did a whole
PennCon,
thing
so
on
is George,
TuneIn.
right?
Mm-hmm.
With T.W.
I am,
so.
yes.
We're mentioning appearances, then, you know,
Yeah.
several of us will be speaking at Archon, which is the exact
This
same
is true,
weekend.
too. Yeah.
This
Cool.
is true.
So you gotta
So
pick
please.
your favorites if you want to go to
Come
PennCon
on.
and hear the boys, or if you want to go to Archon and hear the girls.
Oh, jeez.
But if you're a woman and you are and you're right here in St. Louis, there is the Strong Woman Writing Conference occurring September 16th,
Oh, boy.
and
jeez.
two of the boys in the room, Brad and myself, will be doing yet again our demonstration on writing sword fighting scenes.
Yep.
So we'll be
You're
cutting
not gonna
down
have
each
any
other.
limbs left by the end of this summer.
Oh, that's true. I did draw blood on Brad yesterday.
And also
Again?
the
Again.
Yeah, technically it was the it was the lightsaber and the concrete. We'll get into the lightsabers later. I
They
decided they're a bad sword.
are a bad sword.
Yeah, there's no hilt.
Yes.
Also
Go on.
the next weekend, if you want to learn how to dance West Coast Swing, I'll be at the Renaissance Airport Hotel September 22nd through the 24th over at for Meet Me in St. Louis. This is the West Coast Swing dance competition that will be taking place over there. So they have a whole dance 1, 2, 3 swing project that is free to the public on Saturday. So looking forward to seeing you there.
Speaking of a St. Louis Renaissance Hotel, we do not have a date in stone at this point where I'm recording. By the time you hear this, it will be.
Hopefully.
No, it will be. It will be GatewayCon 2018, the Gateway to Publishing Conference and Convention. Will be in June. It's not changing month. May change weekend though. 2018, St. Louis, at the St. Louis Renaissance Hotel. Watch St. Louis Writer Guild Facebook page, and as well as their website for more information. And with that, you guys have all been waiting long enough. I've had you hooked on here, waiting like an Alfred Hitchcock film on the cliffhanger. What are we talking about today? We're talking about story structure as used by Christopher Nolan.
I believe that was the end of Act 1.
I believe that was the end of Act 1. And somebody please signal the bat signal. The joke here, if you've ever watched any of the Christopher Nolan movies, whether you're a fan of his or not, a lot of his movies are very complex, very psychological.
Time shifting, there's a lot of that.
A lot of time shifting. Sometimes it can be a little hard to follow, but one of the things that you can never miss is the story structure, and probably one of the best ones to show it simply is, and that's a key part of that, is Batman Begins. So with that, I definitely will say, I will go ahead and go on the hook and say the DC universe has a lot to learn in their movie universe from Christopher Nolan. You knocked the ball out of the park with Wonder Woman. Congrats. I am so looking forward to Justice League, hoping you have followed the same path.
DC. Christopher
If
Nolan
you have done Batman v Superman, Man of Steel, or Suicide Squad again, I'm gonna cry. And I'm talking about the style, as far as the story structure. So,
and so ends our kvetching about the
story
DC
structure. What I'm going to go with this next is, what is story structure, and when do you actually focus on it? Kathleen.
I'd actually like to address what you just said.
Oh, okay.
I think
I thought you'd get away with it.
Part of the problem with what DC does, that Christopher Nolan actually does very well, is Christopher Nolan has built character and character values into his story structure.
Yes.
Whereas DC seems to see character and the structure of the story as separate entities, to their detriment. So, I'm sure you're going to link the video that
In fact, I'm going to talk about it right here.
yeah, the video that we saw that talks about Batman Begins in terms of John Truby's book, The Anatomy of Story, and how he talks about story structure and how Nolan uses it in Batman Begins.
Yep.
So, would anyone like to address any of that?
So at this point, you need to pause the video and pause the recording.
No,
and go
do
watch
not
the
pause
video.
us. Do not pause us. There is a video out there on YouTube about Christopher Nolan's story structure.
by
I don't have it
Just
in front of me.
Right.
Just right.
Right. WRIT.
Yes.
Yeah. Just right.
That's the
And
YouTube channel.
Yeah.
That's the YouTube
It's
channel.
a very good YouTube channel.
It is.
And one of the things that it does talk about is, with Christopher Nolan, is the story structure. And he actually does not follow the 3-act structure, he followed the 4-act structure. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. If you were to go by the classic 3-act structure and you looked at Batman v Superman, I would agree with the video that one of the reasons why that one was so lumbering, I'm being polite, was the end of Act 1 took 2 some odd hours to get through. I got you. I see you. And then you had 2 more acts that followed shortly and very quickly thereafter, instead of being very balanced.
Guess what we're gonna do? Define terms. What is 3-act structure?
What is 3-act structure?
How does it relate to beginnings, middles, and ends?
Well, I think you just said the 3-act structure.
I was saying,
Beginning,
I think
middle,
it's the same
end.
thing.
So in 3-act structure, the beginning is Act 1, the middle is Act 2, and the end is Act 3. Are they all roughly equal lengths, or
Not
do they
necessarily.
vary?
No. Well, obviously, he was just talking about one that was not.
Yeah.
It is. Okay. An act is a set of the story in which is an encapsulation of a part of the story, which, according to the video, has an ending defined by an irrevocable decision made by the character that can changes the story, the next act of the story, from what it was. That, I would say, can take as much time as you need. Balanced 3 acts, or balance acts, if you want to say that, because it doesn't have to be 3, tend to work best. When you have an imbalance, it can work. There are tons of movies that do not have a balanced 3-act structure that work well. You have to know that you're doing that, and then you have to figure out why you're doing it, and are you hurting the acts that are shorter, and are you spending too much time in the act that's too long? And usually that's the case, but it doesn't always have to be. I'm trying to think of a good one where it's an offset that actually works. I'm sure they're out there.
And while you're thinking about it, I just want to go and we've kind of, Brad, you kind of did two things, and Kathleen, that's to you. You kind of did two things there. One is you defined 3-act structure very well, and then you talked about the way in which Christopher Nolan has used act structure, and also cut off the word 3-act. 3-act story structure comes to us via Aristotle, and it is that old style. And if you went through high school, at least here in the United States, or especially during the time which I did, you were told that was the only way you could ever write a story. It was always 3 acts, 3 acts, 3 acts. And it's not the case, as with Christopher Nolan will show, and I will talk about later. Go ahead, unless Brad's wanting to take it back. Go ahead, Kathleen.
So what I learned in the one screenwriting class that I ever took, which was fun, but only one, so I am not an expert.
That's why I was going there.
Was a balanced act structure generally in films breaks down to, if you have 120 pages of screenplay, the first 30 pages are Act 1, the second 60 pages are Act 2, and the last 30 pages are Act 3. So you want your middle to be roughly equal to the length of your first and third acts.
Yes.
Yeah. If you go by the 3-act structure, yes.
Yes, I was taught the 3-act structure because that is generally what we learn here in Western culture.
Well, and there's a reason for that. I mean, it's the easiest way of showing the bell curve of the beginning, the middle, and the end. And when I talk about the bell curve, we all know that it's the one that goes up and comes back down pretty evenly. And the reason you have that is you've got your beginning, which is your build up and your lead up. You have your body, which is that main hump that you're dealing with, and then you have the end, the third act, which is the trailing off there. And you can move that act structure around however you wish. Screenwriting is a huge part of this, and not just screenwriting, playwriting. So much is done in the 3-act play. I mean, that is so much. But however, there is the 2-act play and the 1-act play. And when you get into playwriting, you learn the differences between these and how to do this. There are 4-act plays. There are plays with multiple acts and stuff like this. There are plays that have, like Shakespeare is a fan of doing the 3 acts, but then also kind of breaking up each act
he's
into
5 acts.
Exactly. Well, and he'll break up, and that's what I mean, breaking up some of the acts into other acts in themselves, which is an interesting way of doing things. So there are a ton of models out there. You are right, we've learned this, and part of the reason we've learned this, it's the easiest way of teaching it. When I teach kids how to write a story, and when we sit there in a fight, scene, like we're doing a workshop, we talk about the beginning, the middle, and the end. You have the, inciting incident, the, action that happens around that, and the resolution that comes from that. And that simple structure is really easy to teach, and it allows everyone to have that nice foundation of storytelling that you need to storytell. You have to have these things. Now, the beauty part is you can add in other things in there so long as you've got that 3-act structure turn into a 5-act structure, a 7-act structure, or something like that. If you look at some of these long series, some of them, even though they're multiple books, you can look at the overall arcing series as a series of acts. And what happens within each one of them, especially if it's like hugely connected, like Tolkien or something like that. So there are multiple ways of looking at stories. And one of the things I find that Christopher Nolan does beautifully is thinking about how the story needs to be told. And I love the 4-quarter thing that they describe and how he does conflict. It's a beautiful way of setting up conflict. But what it really does is allow him to dive into story, dive deeply into it, give us a really layered sense of it. And if you see his other movies, you'll start to see this, like the way Inception breaks down and how that kind of works. And then he'll twist that, which is the beauty part. So I love the way he plays with story.
Speaking about the most common genre in films and in books, that is the most popular ones, romance and mystery. Those are rarely balanced 3-act structures. They are sort of 3-act structures with a beginning, a complication, a rising action, to a point where the couple gets together for what you expect to be the happily ever after, or in the mystery, we have the problem solved. We know who the murderer is, and justice is about to come down in a very short denouement at the end. And that is the most satisfying structure, typically, for most books and movies. That is at least what sells best. And so this structure that Mr. Nolan has is a bit outside the box. And it's outside the box, and many people may well consider it a bit boring, because what he does is a little play, another little play, another little play, another little play, and maybe a dozen little plays, which all are very similar. They have slightly different themes in each one. Am I wrong on that take?
Actually, I've got something for you in regards to that,
Yeah.
because of all the screenwriting classes I've recently been taking. But before I go there, because that's going to be a very long explanation, I'm going to let George go, and then I'm going to jump on what I've been learning.
I just wanted to kind of add on to what Brad was talking about when he said how the 3-act structure is the easiest one to teach. It's also the most common setup structure, basically, like for a screenplay that's out there right now. These days, the theaters are littered with either like adaptations, reboots, sequels, anything that is familiar. Anything that is not familiar.
Bankable? Let's say bankable.
Yeah, we'll go with bankable. Anything that is looked at as an original property that's taking a chance, you have to have that sort of 3-act structure in order to give your audience just a somewhat of a bit of familiarity, so that they don't feel like they're just kind of fumbling around in the dark. If you give them some sort of a flashlight, like the 3-act structure, then they're able to somewhat kind of follow along. Now, the beautiful thing about Batman Begins is Christopher Nolan knew that he was dealing with a very iconic character, somebody who definitely needed a really good, fresh reboot 8 years after the atrocity that was Batman and Robin. So, happy 20-year anniversary, by the way, Batman and Robin. Just to throw that out there. Basically, so what he did that I feel was really brilliant, he could have done the 3-act structure with that, and that would have been completely fine. But he took the chance and went with the 4-act structure, and it wound up becoming a much more enriching experience, because you're not 100% sure where it's going, like, as it goes on. But at the same time, you love what he's doing with this character. You love that it's getting so far back to its roots that you're just like you're waiting to see what happens next. And I give Christopher Nolan a whole lot of credit for that.
Well, I was watching YouTube videos this morning about Christopher Nolan and about story structure, because I'm a nerd. Mm-hmm. And one of the things one of the videos mentioned was that a lot of films seem to fall into one of two categories: the more artistic or cerebral, or entertaining with kind of mass appeal. And Christopher Nolan is very good at making films that appeal to both sorts of audiences.
Agreed.
So with Batman Begins, he created a film that was certainly entertaining, certainly a blockbuster sort of film, but also is very cerebral in how it deals with themes, and is very artistic in how it approaches character, which is done well, and building character opposition, building four-corner opposition, as Brad mentioned, into the story structure.
I'll actually throw you one better about that. Like, one of the great things about Christopher Nolan, like the fact that he is able to play with this type of story structure. You can also see that very evident in, I believe, in The Dark Knight, because that one has, I don't think that has 4 acts to it. It goes in that one I would call a very, like, kind of an unbalanced film in terms of, like, where each act starts and ends.
It's actually,
but
it follows the act structure, which I'm going to talk about when it gets to me, which is the 8-act structure.
Exactly, and the beautiful thing about, like, it's so unbalanced, but at the same time, it plays to its main theme. Batman Begins is, to whittle it down to one word, is fear.
Right.
The Dark Knight, chaos.
Right.
And that works perfectly with an 8-act structure that is kind of all over the place. But for some way, somehow, it works really, really well.
What's an 8-act structure
exactly,
David?
I'll get to that, but I'll let Brad go first.
I was just going to say real quick, and then you can go on about the 8-act structure, that what Nolan's doing and why he's a genius at it is the cerebral movies that you were mentioning. The reason they don't have the mass appeal is because they cause you to think, they make you think, and you have to think about the movie you're watching.
Right.
The mass appeal, you don't have to think about. It's raw entertainment in front of you that has a simple enough storyline that you can probably come in the middle and still figure it all out. What he's genius about, though, is giving you that cerebral storyline with enough with enough of a kind of simple, beginning and intro. I can't think of the word I'm trying to find. Anyway, point being that it is the ability to kind of like have that first layer that is simple enough for everyone to understand, and then having that kind of onion effect of the multiple layers following it that go deeper and deeper to the level of however deep you want to get. And I think Inception's probably his greatest at this.
I'll go with that.
Being that you can watch Inception and it's cool and trippy and the land comes up and it's all about dream diving, simple enough to understand. It's cool and trippy. But, take it deeper and deeper and suddenly you'll start wondering, well, what's really happening at the end? Is he actually in a dream? Is it his dream? Is it her dream? What is it? What is it? Is his thing actually the spinning top? Or is that not his thing? And the kids going out there. And like when you get into this level, suddenly now you're, in a coffee house at like 3 a.m. having a conversation about like crazy Christopher Nolan movies. And, just how deep into the rabbit hole do you really want to go? And that's the beauty of Nolan. He can give you something simple, like The Dark Knight, that we can all jump onto, or The Batman Begins, that we can all glom onto. And yet, we'll be making YouTube videos about, this kind of stuff for years, because there's enough layering in it that you can go as deep as you want and think about it as much as you want.
Yep, I would totally agree. I'm not going to go fully into the whole entire 8-act structure, which actually really, in my opinion, is a 9-act structure. So you can easily argue the 9-act structure is really 3 acts. So, but what I am going to talk about is what I've been learning. Let me go back in time a bit. When I lost my full-time job and started to decide I was going to actually jump into this full-time, one of the things I realized is I had to relearn what I had learned. Yes, I've been part of Right Back all this time, but it was still a lot of... I was coming back full swing in my writing. And it took a while too. So I took some classes, and I went back and I took some classes through Screenwriting U, which is an online screenwriting course system done by Hal Grossman, or Grossman. I'm probably mispronouncing his last name, and I apologize. But basically, he has a method that's called the mini movie method, which goes with what Fedora was talking about a little while ago with kind of her dislike of Christopher Nolan. Instead of, and I've applied this to novel writing, but it doesn't matter. What that is instead of writing one long novel, you're writing 8 short stories, episodic like stories going with it. And each one has a purpose in the overall structure. The best way to look at this is laying Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey on top of it. You've got the wave of the status quo and the call to adventure. Then you've got the next one, which is you're locked into conflict. To borrow this phrase, think about Mission Impossible Rogue Nation. Mission Impossible Rogue Nation starts off status quo. We have what's his name? My mind just went blank.
Ethan Hunt.
Ethan Hunt, thank you. I wanted to avoid the actor's name. Ethan Hunt. He's trying to get on a plane saving the world. And then he goes to the record store. The record store is where he's getting the old style vinyl record that ends up having the instructions for his next act, his next mission, should he decide to accept it. But what happens? Suddenly the entire thing is locked. He's filling up with smoke. This bad guy has a woman who was his contact, has a gun to her head, shoots her, and you see Ethan Hunt trying to escape, and he collapses unconscious in the little record hearing listening booth. locked into conflict. That's part 2. Next one is, and I'm doing this off the top of my head, I was hoping I could pull my notes up and I can't. The next part would be is the protagonist tries to solve a problem but fails. Then protagonist has another idea, midpoint crisis. Antagonism rules would be causing the protagonist to withdraw. Protagonist has a brand new plan. Ultimate crisis, then the climax. And if I missed anything, I might have in there because that's before so it's calling that off the top of my head. But what Hal talks about and what I see Christopher Nolan doing in all of his movies, whether or not he knows this particular process or not, that's not sure. Because story structure is story structure. Is that I can see these segments broken down, and it makes writing them easier. Where it really applied, in my opinion, is on the rewrite. And I'll say this offhand, I have a question for everybody. After I have 2 people ask questions here, we're waiting very patiently for me to shut up. Is where do you apply story structure the most? Are you most conscious about it when you are doing your initial draft, your initial plot, or on your rewrites? I'll go and let them go first, and then I'm going to answer my own question, then I'll jump around.
No, I'll just answer your question. Don't worry about it.
Okay, then, and do you want to go, or do you want to...
Sure, I'll go. You said that I don't like it stuff. Not entirely true. There's one film that I do like, and that is The Prestige.
Oh, good movie.
Very good movie.
Prestige has a simple enough outline.
Yep.
It is 2 magicians who are in competition with each other and become terribly obsessive about it to the point where they're ready for murder or anything at all. And every facet of their life is involved in it, which is what I'm talking about with the episodic kind of structure. It seems to me that Mr. Nolan relies a lot upon the same techniques that Homer did. I think he goes back farther than our 3-act structure into the most primitive of storytelling, which is linking this story to the next story to the next.
Yep.
And the only thing really that I dislike about that story is that it's a bit dark for my taste.
Which makes it perfect for me. But deal with that. One of the sad things is a sidebar to it, then I'm going to go ahead and answer my question I mentioned to go. Actually, I'll repeat my question and then answer it. One of the sidebars is, we know the 3-act structure came down to us from Aristotle because his works survived. Beyond that, who knows who influenced him as far as the act structure, and it probably does go back, way back into earliest part of writing about writing. So, sadly, history, we've lost a lot. Okay, the question was, where do you focus the most on story structure? Do you focus on it mostly at your plot? Do you focus on it when you're writing your first draft, or do you focus on it on your rewrites? My answer to this is, it is my guide in my plot. I actually plotted my story structure. Then I'm writing my story, and I'm following the plot along, but I'm not super concerned about it. Number one, it's like following GPS, as far as I'm concerned. Following GPS when you're driving. You know you're going to get there because you're listening to the directions you hope are correct. So I've got it side by side. But when my first rewrite occurs, story structure is my first focus. And then everything, I bother with wordsmithing as far as I'm concerned. That's perfectionism. That's the very last thing I ever focus on. I want to focus on everything else before that. So who would like to go first? And then Jen, Brad.
All right, so me?
Yep.
Well, you're going to hate my answer.
That's fine.
I'm a plotter, but I actually don't plot according to any given structure or enter any story with that much of a plan. The nature of humans and how we tell stories and how we feel sometimes structures our stories in that way. If you took Threadcaster, you could probably break it into as many different acts as you want to. But all I know is that when you're reading the book, and when I'm plotting the book, I get the feeling I need a big decision event here. I need a big decision event here. I need an emotional event here because I'm more interested in my A story, B story, C story braid. And that's how I do my plotting. So all this story structure stuff is very interesting for analyzing other people's work. And I'm not saying that I know what a stupid idea. How dare we have this topic in this show? It's interesting to hear about, and it's definitely fun to apply to movies and books or whatever. But when I sit down to write a story, mostly I'm going with how it feels and what feels right. And then I'd be interested to hear other people dissect my work and tell me what I did, because I have no idea.
Okay, I've got at least 2 dovetails. And who else do I have as a dovetail straight to Jen? 3 dovetails. Are you dovetail?
Kind of.
Okay, then Kathleen or Brady? I can't tell which one was first.
I was going to pull a line from the Writing Excuses podcast, which is lovely, because I operate in a similar way with Jen. I go with what feels right for the story, and when a big decision happens, I'm not consciously thinking, well, an act has ended here. I'll think about structure and what is missing if something is broken and I can't figure out what it is. So if something is clearly wrong with the story, but I can't put my finger on it, I'll try and analyze the story and break things down a little bit. Be that character arc or story structure and how lopsided things might be to figure out what the problem is so I can fix it. So structure's not my first thought, but it is a guideline to help with troubles that arise.
That's
Brad?
Okay, so you are not actually off with how you do this, and I would say not the majority, but a lot of writers out there are just like you, and I am too. I don't think about the act structure of my book as I'm writing it. The only time I actually think about act structure when I'm actually writing is when I'm writing plays. And that is because the acts in a play are very definite terms that are set up in certain ways. The acts of a novel are a little bit smudged on the lines. A lot. And I would say that we've gotten into darker territory here in the sense that we're not all just talking about act structure, we're talking about scene structure, and that's a little bit different. Scene structure I do from the get-go, from plotting on. And the reason is because you figure out the way the scenes naturally unfold in a story. We've talked about that before. As writers, that's kind of our job, is to know how stories naturally unfold. It creates an entire story that way, but also it's, the universe on, cause and effect comes into play when you're in a story. Certain things are going to happen, that causes certain things to happen, that causes other things to happen. That's how stories unfold. So it's not necessarily, I agree with you, that this is something that we all focus on as we write. It is something more we use to analyze what we've written. But really what it comes into play is, as you said, at some point, in the first third-ish of your novel, there has to be a big moment. That's the end of Act 1. Then you start up Act 2. The setup of Act 1 is what then, and the decision made is what causes Act 2 to be framed the way that it is. And then you have a big event at the 3/4-ish mark or the halfway mark or wherever you feel it's usually going to be at that 3/4-ish mark. Another big decision that then leads to the end of your book, the climax and the end, the low moment, the black moment, wherever you're writing towards, or whatever's going on there. That's when structure comes into play. That's when we know what we're doing. That's when we think about this. But I don't know how many people actually sit down and are like, here's my first act, and they just start going down that way. It's not a bad way to look at it, but it is something that I think that writers do almost sort of naturally and then go back to.
It's very plotter, for the strict plotter who plots scenes out and their outline is extremely rigid. It's a very plotter thing to do. So thinking act structure. Which is funny.
I'm sorry, I'm going to jump over to George, but I'm going to say this real fast. You guys, especially Jen and Brett, are the ones who talked me out of being a pantser. No. Understand something from me for a second. I thought, and I took that story, which is why I ended up where I'm at now, to be more plot, and understand it. And now I'm at a point of like, you're pantsing more than I am.
So, moving on. I
find it
plot, you
weird.
plot scene structure. You don't necessarily plot act structure.
Oh.
Unless you want to.
Yeah, I do. Now,
Hey, you
but-
said that you rely really heavily on it, in which
Yeah.
case I say you keep going.
Exactly.
It's working for you, you do the thing.
I'm not changing. I already changed
I'm
enough.
personally very plot driven in terms of like the way that I like my stories. I just like I am like I've always said, like I'm very impatient. I just want to get like the story started as quickly as possible. And when I sit down to do my outline, especially from the last one I did, Ever Upward, I had it in mind about like what to do regarding like the 3-act structure and everything, but I wasn't fully committed to setting my spot for like, okay, this is where Act 1 ends and this is where Act 2 ends. I wasn't thinking about that until after I had finished the outline. Then I just kind of went back and did a little bit of touching up and everything. The main thing that I really wanted to make sure that I was doing was I was creating this structure without shoehorning my characters into following it.
Mm-hmm.
Everything had to be natural. Everything had to have a really good flow to it. You can tell if characters are suddenly doing things because the story tells them to.
Yeah. I was just, what Kathleen said earlier, the,
When stuff is broken.
No, go ahead.
yes. What? You said after George.
Okay, go.
No, I wasn't paying too much attention to the actual story structure per se, but I knew there was something wrong with the story. And basically it just kind of seemed like there were all these details all over the place, and it seemed like there was these things that it was important for backstory for people to know, but it didn't seem related to the main plot. And I'm not sure if this had to do with structure per se or uniting theme, which also the Nolan video, if you watch it, had that there was like a uniting theme in it. And I was thinking, okay, so what is the theme, even if the reader doesn't get it, that is there a central theme that all my characters have a different view about? I mean, it certainly isn't fear for my story, but is there one? So I was thinking maybe that'd be a way to focus the story. So I guess that would be a way of story editing. So it would be the story first draft editing where you're actually content editing, definite big content editing.
Well, I think Jennifer and I might be soulmates
Aw.
because my process, I know I'm ready to start a book if I know exactly when it happened and how it starts and what the black moment is. And that's as much structure as I need, because to me the scenes have to come out of the characters and the conflict between and among the characters. And that's where the scene comes from. So I don't see how I can plot that until I know what my characters want to do. And when they tell me what they want to do, I will thwart them at it and have a scene.
I will say, and I'm going to jump over here to Chanel, who's waiting patiently, then Brad's after her. I will say this has inspired another Right Pack Radio episode I'm getting ready to put down for season 5, and that is creating our characters. So, and because to borrow from my wife behind me here, I've always plotted my characters. Go ahead.
Okay, so
Right?
largely pantsing here. I have to sort of let it, like my when I do stories, it's almost like a pregnancy. It literally has to literally grow and develop and develop and develop, and then when it's ready to come out, it's going to come out whether I want it to or not. So it has this sort of almost not even of my own accord for me, the way that I work with creating stories. Now the thing is, how does story structure work into that? It doesn't for me consciously. Like, I can have all these things and listen to all the podcasts and listen to you guys talk about it, and it'd be great, but it's not something that I have something in the forefront of my mind. It is something that is probably in like a file drawer behind, how to do long division, and it and it can stay there until I need to pull it out, which is usually Not necessarily when things are broken, but usually it does not inform the way that I write it. If it does, I find that things become a little bit too forced, a little bit too formulaic, and it has to come in on the back end for me, just because otherwise it feels like I'm shoehorning these events and these characters into something that they are not meant to be in.
So I think I deleted my long division file. I'm pretty certain I deleted that.
Start with this. No, go ahead.
So one of the things I want to throw out is the structure of my own novel, which is Iron Horseman. We're talking about how did we do it. I did not do this intentionally, but thinking back on it, this is definitely the structure of the story. It's a 4-act structure. It's not a 3-act structure, but the 3rd act is so small, most people would probably miss it unless they were really paying attention to it. The 1st act is obviously the kids at Eton and everything like that, and escaping Eton, and the decision, as they talk about in the video, the decision that is irrevocable and changes the story around is the decision to sneak onto the airship and fly away, go chase after their parents. That's Act 1. Act 2 is chasing after their parents, which involves going to Gibraltar and Malta and all these different things like that. And that is, Malta probably represents the end of Act 2 and the beginning of Act 3, because it is the flip of the father-son relationship. And then that is actually a fairly short act, because the 4th act definitely begins when Alexander decides to take action on his own and not worry about what the adults are doing around him. And in doing that, that is definitely a 4-act structure. We were talking about theme and how themes can pull characters together. That's hugely true. In fact, it's something I do a lot of. In fact, they talked about in the Nolan video, having characters with similar goals. And he says you need more than just characters with similar goals. You need characters with contrasting values.
Right.
And that is like, I'm more on the goal side, and I've brought in some of the values thing in the Iron Horseman trilogy, especially as I went on, because I thought about it more and more. So the values thing definitely comes in more in 2 and 3 than 1, but they're all there. But that's how I think about it, and I purposely gave my characters competing goals amongst themselves. Like, if you look at the 3 sides, which is the Templars, the kids, and the Knights of the Golden Circle, those 3, they share a lot of goals, actually. They're just goals that are meant for different reasons. Some people want to save the world, other people want to destroy the world, some people don't care if it gets destroyed, other people want to save it, but for other reasons than you would think. And in twisting all that up and doing all that is where I can bring in that kind of, nuance and character traits and have the fun of kind of playing off of that. And then I did it through all 3. The other thing I would say is I looked at all 3 books as Book 1 is Act 1 of the trilogy, Book 2 is Act 2 of the trilogy, and Book 3 is the 3rd act of the trilogy. And in doing that, it was a way of structuring out the entire trilogy so that I knew that the first book was about setting you up and setting Alexander up as a character and what his life choices were. And at the end of 1, there's a huge decision. At the end of the first book, there's a huge decision. That affects Book 2, which then kind of rolls, and that has a whole thing and a whole journey of an arc of its own. And at the end of 2, there's a huge decision made that changes everything for Book 3. And in doing that, that was done very purposely. In fact, if I'd say anything about me plotting out my act structure, it was plotting out the acts of the trilogy, not necessarily the scene structure.
Well, I'd like to go with, you talked a bit about the characters' opposition going for goals. I want to talk very briefly about what we have with Christopher Nolan. He actually used John Turby.
John Truby.
Thank you.
Who wrote?
I'm going to have to read that book now.
Wrote
It's
The
called
Anatomy of Story. Thank you. I have my own copy, but it's down in my writing office. I'm glad that Kathleen has it. I just had a squint to read it from this distance.
Trust Kathleen to have a copy of anything you need.
Yes. And I just want to point out what he did with this. I'm going to use the Batman Begins because that's probably the most common movie that everybody who's listening to this podcast has seen. and then I'm tossing this over to Kathleen, not only because she's waiting patiently to ask a question, but I want to hear what she does with story structure. So, what he did was he had, if you take Batman, Ra's al Ghul, the Scarecrow, and Falcone, and put them into 4 boxes, and put them in opposite sides of each other. They all use one
Batman
thing.
is the 4th box.
Yes,
Sorry.
Batman's the 4th box, and that is fear. That is what that entire story is about, as George pointed out earlier. Falcone, as we talked about in the video, or as the video talks about, Falcone uses fear for control, from power. He uses fear to control the people of Gotham.
He uses it selfishly against civilians.
Exactly, selfishly against civilians. And you see the first act kind of ending, or you see the act ending when Batman takes out Falcone and you see the costume for the first time. Then you've got, actually, sorry, that's the end of the second act.
That's the end of Act 2.
That's the end of Act 2. First act is when Batman,
Origin story.
Yeah.
when
Batman's
Bruce
origin.
When he decides not
chooses
to kill
not to kill.
and leaves the League of Shadows.
Right. So then your next act is Scarecrow, who is using fear against the criminals because he can.
Selfishly.
Thank you. I want you guys to add, please. So, and then you have Ra's al Ghul, who has a noble use of fear. He wants to make the people of Gotham get back away from their bad ways of living, but of course we see that being in a bad way. He's using fear, dare say it, as a terrorist. So, with that, of course, the only one who survives that, the only philosophy that survives is Batman, who uses fear against criminals to stop them from committing crimes.
Altruism for both him and Ra's al Ghul.
Yeah.
Right.
Only one sort of altruism is okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's selfish fear against the people, selfish fear against criminals. What are those? Criminals.
I don't know how to print that.
Altruistic fear against the people, altruistic fear against criminals,
Uh-huh.
and the altruistic fear against criminals is the only right way.
He's
Right.
the last man standing.
Yeah.
Literally, is Batman who uses it that way.
Yes.
Right, and
The
that's
only
the way.
reason that it's the way that the victor is because Batman punches or explodes everybody else.
Exactly. So, and that's what I just wanted to point out when Brad was talking about his characters and his structure there. I'm going to kind of show you what's Christopher Nolan, what's going back to the part. So, kicking it over to Kathleen.
So the book The Anatomy of Story is things John Truby applies to screenwriting but can apply to all
yes.
sorts of media. But one of the things that he talks about is the designing principle, how you're going to tell your story. So,
What is that?
I
I know the
I'll
answer,
give you an
but what is
example. The Godfather
One of my favorites. Go ahead.
is told in a similar manner to, you know, the third son becomes king sort of fairy tale structure. And that seems like structure as well. And we've been talking a lot about acts, but I think for a lot of us, we don't necessarily think in acts. We think in how does this story need to be told. So I was going to bring up an example of the short story that I have on Nightmare Magazine. I told it traditionally the first time I wrote it. It had a beginning, a middle, end. It had one narrator, and it wasn't working. So when I started thinking about structurally different ways that I could tell that story, I learned about the triptych from my Clarion class, which is basically a story told in 3 parts, and the 3 parts together tell the story, but each part is sort of its own thing. And once I had the structure of a triptych through which to tell the story, I could use 3 narrators and give them each their own story, but together their stories told a larger story. And with that sort of designing principle, I was able to structure the story and make it successful. So I think that's something that we don't all think in acts. So how do you guys figure out how you want to tell a story? Like, what does a story usually tell you?
I would say very few people think in acts. We all think in scenes.
Mm-hmm.
That the way scenes unfold and the way they link together and how they can do that. And, you know, your idea of changing it up and using the triptych style, there are other ways you can do it. And that, I would say, almost forces you not to think in acts if you're doing that way. And like I said, I think the act structure is something that we apply almost to a story after we're done.
Yes.
We think about it, you know, we've all mentioned it here. Beautifully, we have a subconscious. We all have a subconscious, and I love ours. The human subconscious is a fun thing, especially when it can drive for me and do all that kind of fun stuff. But one of the things it can do is it sits back there thinking about act structure and story structure and the way things unfold and cause and effect and all of that, which allows me then to just write a story that I want to tell, a story that I want, that I think the characters are going to do next, what happens and everything that kind of goes into that. And I think when you're editing is when you can apply that kind of story structure. When you're thinking about your book, when you're thinking about the books you're going to write, this is a time for story structure, act structure, these kinds of thoughts. When you're writing, I would say just write to get it out of you and worry about that stuff later. But I think for a lot of writers, this is something that happens more in our subconscious than our conscious.
Jen, then Fedora, Kathleen, Chanel, George.
Okay.
Basically.
My shtick on this show is always character driven, and that's how my plots tend to go. I break it down into character stories: my A story, my B story, my C story, and each one of those stories has their own arc, and the arc is the beginning, middle, and end. Without spoiling Threadcaster, Kat's story about she's the main character. I don't expect everyone in the audience to have read my novel, but you can.
You need to. No.
You definitely can go get a copy, please.
At Main Street Books.
And leave a review on Amazon. But Kat's story goes from having a it's all the theme, the overarching theme of Threadcaster is sacrifice and justice. And so Kat sees something's unfair and is unwilling to sacrifice. And then her arc sees her encountering injustice and seeing the true face of injustice and reaching the point where she's willing to sacrifice to find justice in that. And then I throw a rain shatter at the end.
Yay.
And I know to complete that arc that we need to start one place, end another place, and have a black moment in the middle. While at the same time, my B story characters, Trace's B story is about truth and learning, holding to your truth and what you believe in, then learning more and changing your mind and then taking the right side. I know that he needs to start one way and end another way, and there needs to be a black moment in the middle. It just so happens that his and Kat's black moments happen in the same scene, which works out pretty well. And I guess the third story being the bad guys, that black moment kind of happens because one dies. But it's each of those stories have their own structure, so therefore it's about braiding them together and making them work. And I don't care so much about the whole plot fitting together. I'm more concerned with my individual characters and whether their stories are satisfying.
I think Mr. Nolan's structure has a potential bad effect, and that is that it can be very precious, it can be very repetitious. Memento, for example, strikes me as being Groundhog Day without Bill Murray and without a sense of humor. Guy Pearce is looking for his wife's rapist killer person, and he gets a little progress, and then boom, he has this terrible amnesiac disease that nobody else in the world has, and he starts over. And I found it just really annoying.
He thought it was
this is a danger with this kind of structure, so be real careful with him, folks.
Yeah, actually, that story follows what's called a hairpin. But anyway, we'll talk. That's something else. Yep.
If you want to, you can watch the second video. Yeah. It's linked too.
It's linked for us, not for our audience. Sorry.
Well, we can link it for the audience.
They can link.
Well. They can search for it on the YouTube.
Yeah, search for it on YouTube.
Do you have any?
Oh, I was just going to agree with Jen. 150 bajillion %.
Right.
Character-driven stories are my heart and soul. So I am character-driven almost to the detriment of my plot if I let myself wallow in it too much. But I just want to get really into these characters and sort of immerse myself in them to the point where I don't even know who I am anymore, and then just kind of let them walk me around. Like, this is, okay, this character in this position, where are we going? Show me what's happening. And that's a lot of the way that I write. So, trying to put that into an act structure, like I said, it doesn't really quite work for me. But if I were to try to let my subconscious do the driving, somehow it just works.
Mm-hmm.
I just hope that it doesn't get deleted. Long division can go, but storytelling needs to stay.
Get a couple copies.
Well, you have to practice it.
And this will be closing thought.
And I also just want to give one last shout out to Christopher Nolan, because like not only does he have like a very basic story structure and everything for Batman Begins, but he also has like a 3-act structure that applies to the entire trilogy.
Yes.
Because you have this this very structured Act 1, and then you have the chaotic and wonderful Act 2, and then you have like the come down Act 3. Now, is Dark Knight Rises the weakest of the 3? Yes, but at the same time, it still has enough in it to want you to keep going all the way to the end, especially when you're given the end of Act 2, when Bane gets to fulfill Ra's al Ghul's destiny. And you get to basically just kind of give Bruce Wayne like one last challenge to literally rise from where he is. And so you have like a very basic 4-act structure in The Dark Knight Rises, the same as Batman Begins. It's not as clean, but at the same time it's there. So, so a big shout out to Nolan for being able to accomplish that with his entire trilogy.
And with that note, have a great week writing. Tune in next week for yet another interesting topic in the writing industry. Take care. The new theme songs for Right Pack Radio were written and performed by Meredith Tate. All copyrights remain with her. Writers, agents, and publishers, for the first time since the Gutenberg Press, find themselves lost in a maze of mystery as technology alters the shape of the publishing industry. Searching for Answers is a group of writers throwing pop culture, writing, and publishing into a crucible of clarity, passion, and humor. This group is the Right Pack. Welcome back to Right Back Radio. This is your host, producer, and crazy author, David Allen Lucas, president of St. Louis Writers Guild, president of Winding Trails Media, and executive producer. It's amazing what happens when one person runs a whole show. And as well as working currently back on writing psychologically dark stories, studying the darker side of humanity by telling superhero stories. As well as working on my dark poetry, which it was recently amazed by some people.
Of the Burbs.
Yeah, the it of the recent Festival of the Burbs in Chesterfield on the literary arts side. I'm sorry, Brad. I know you read. I thought you read was fantastic, but
I'm sure it was.
Nobody wanted to hear about Diogenes.
Nobody wanted to hear about that. They wanted to hear about children going missing and people dying for drugs.
Well, it was a music festival.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, granted.
Certain crowd.
And we are going to have a very interesting topic today, so sit tight. I can guarantee you're going to be wanting to hear it. But I just got a couple of quick announcements for myself, and then I'm going to kick this over to my beautiful co